we're going to move on this afternoon for the second session. And this second session is designed to actually introduce you to the reference document and what it says. So this reference document was written as a tool and method series back in 2020. It was published in 2021. It derives from the work done by INTPA and at the time the Inequality Research Facility led by AFD and funded by the EU, where we have all contributed, Mathilde, Teresa here, and a few more of us, including Enda David that you have seen on video. So without more time on introducing, I would like to pass the floor to Mathilde, and we start presenting.
Let's go. Thank you so much, Jérôme, and thank you all again for being here for this second session. Do not hesitate, to make this second session interacting, to put your camera on if you can. Always a pleasure to see you all. So we will begin this second session by introducing very briefly the reference document, because it was something that it was mentioned during the first session and that we will continue mentioning. So it was published in 2021. And as you may know, and as Jérôme said, so it was written in collaboration with Adelante, Teresa, Jérôme, AFD, but also with the other EU thematic unit. Everyone has contributed to this important reference document. So the objective of this reference document is really to support you, to strengthen your approach to development cooperation to address inequalities in its partner countries. And while it recognizing the importance of inequality and all its aspects, indeed it focuses more on income inequality, because as Teresa mentioned in the first session, income inequality is both the product and the source of most of the aspect of inequality. And it's also the easier to measure because we have more data on it. But even if you focus on it, it doesn't mean that we do not consider the multiple aspects of inequalities. And that's why in the second volume of the reference document, we have worked on 18 policy sectors, reflecting all the sectors on which income inequality could be related. So social protection, fiscal, environment, climate change, employment, etc., etc. And we will continue to review that through the week. So the reference document has 3 volumes, volume 1, 2, and 3. Volume 1 dedicated to the concept and definition, volume 2 to the policy brief, and volume 3 to the guideline for mainstreaming the reduction of inequality and intervention. In session 1, we focus on the concept and definition. During the week, we will review the policy sector that are linked with inequalities, and during this session we'll focus more on volume 3. Just before showing you a brief video that will summarize the structure of a reference document, to let you know that you can access it in our space. Now there is a page dedicated to resources, and you can find all this document. So we will show you now where you can find all these precious resources, not only from INTPA G4 unit, but also from other sectors who will present you their approach during the week. So please do not hesitate to have a look on it. So you can find the reference document here, but you can also find it in our Capacity for Dev group. You can find the link of Capacity for Dev in the resource page of the house space. And the reference document was published in 2021, so it's also available, publicly available. So if you go to Google and just type reference document inequality, we'll be able to find it easily. And now we can watch a short video.
Inequality refers to the unequal distribution of goods, resources, and rights, and can have a profound impact on all dimensions of sustainable development, especially poverty, hindering poverty reduction efforts and growth. It can be measured in terms of opportunities or outcomes between people who have a shared identity, such as gender, ethnicity, religion, or geographical location, and be manifested in incomes, social goods, environmental resources, or decision-making. The EU has produced a guide, help make its development cooperation more effective in addressing inequalities. It comprises 3 volumes. Volume 1 on the concepts. Volume 2 includes a set of 18 policy briefs for the design of policies. Volume 3 outlines the guiding principles and tools to mainstream the reduction of inequalities across all operations. The focus is on economic inequality, which is the difference between people in terms of income, money received, consumption, goods and services purchased, wealth, the sum of assets. These concepts are explained in Volume 1 on the theoretical background and trends. Total income equality is neither possible nor desirable. The objective is to have less income inequality, with a focus on extreme disparities, as called for by the 2030 Agenda. There are diverse factors that determine income inequality, including trade, taxation and transfers, migration, demography, education and health, functioning of institutions, democracy and social cohesion, gender policies, economic development and shocks, the labour market, natural resources, and infrastructure. Volume 2 of the guide presents 18 policy briefs to guide the design of different policies linked to these issues. The EU believes that development cooperation must be more responsive to the challenge of reducing inequalities and addressing its causes. The guide demonstrates how EU cooperation can better address the drivers of inequality by investing in education, widening access to land and finance, addressing gender inequalities, using digitalization to serve the needs of the poorest, promoting decent work, targeting investments for the bottom 40%, maximizing the employment potential of investment and trade, supporting resource mobilization and progressive fiscal policies, providing universal social protection and health coverage, fighting climate change, protecting the most vulnerable. Volume 3 presents a set of guiding principles and recommendations and is packed full of useful tools to help EU staff and partners mainstream the reduction of inequalities across all operations. By using an inequality lens, we can be challenged to think differently about the opportunities and outcomes of our cooperation. 4 core principles are recommended. They are: apply the beneficiary approach through participation and consultation, promote accountability and transparency, redistribution and the targeting of the bottom 40%, address spatial inequalities and inequalities between groups. Volume 3 proposes options on how to address difficult challenges, as inequality can be contentious. Structural causes of inequality can go beyond the policy sphere. Quantifying evidence on inequalities requires data, which can be costly and difficult to ascertain. We demonstrate in a practical way how to ensure analysis on how budgets and resources benefit different locations or groups, support national statistical capacities, promote dialogue amongst all stakeholders. This EU Inequalities Guide calls for a shift in our approach to make development cooperation more responsive to this fundamental development challenge. This is needed now more than ever and will help achieve sustainable development that truly leaves no one behind. Use, apply, and share this guide and lead the change for a more equal world.
So as you have seen in the video, so it gives you a very, I hope, a good overview of the structure of the reference document and the 3 volumes. And today, during this session, we'll focus more precisely on the volume 3. So we really hope during this session to be able to give you some guidance, some tools, concrete tools, in order to help you to mainstream inequality throughout the project cycle. And we will begin by expliciting the fact that any policy or program can reduce inequalities if they are following some key principle and and key guidance. And the first one, as we have already mentioned in the session one, is the necessity to target beneficiaries and the most vulnerable, more precisely the bottom poorest 40%. That should be done not only during the design phase, but also during the formulation phase. And during the last day of this training, we will give you and show you some concrete tools in order to target beneficiaries, and especially by using the distributional impact assessment. Being a complex tool, we decided to dedicate one session on that in the morning of the last day. In addition to target the most vulnerable and marginalized, we also need to include them in the process through the programming and the project cycle. But as Teresa has mentioned, it could be very difficult to reach them. It's one thing to target them, but it is another thing to reach them and then to include them in the project cycle. And we'll give you now some tips in order to know how to do it. So the first thing is indeed to ask you some key question. And this key question could be, who are the poorest and marginalized? Where are they? How can they be targeted? And in order to do that, we will review some guidance, which could be very useful to answer to this question at the end. So without waiting, let's summarize and review the guiding principle I mentioned. So there are 4 guiding principles to adopt for mainstreaming the reduction of inequality. The first guiding principle is a beneficiary approach, meaning involvement and social dialogue. Then the principle of accountability, redistribution, targeting the bottom 40%. And finally, a last principle on which we insist in the reference document is addressing spatial inequalities and geographical targeting.
Okay, so I take over from Matilde here. So welcome everyone again to this second session. So let's start with the first principle provided in the guiding document, which is a beneficiary approach. So the beneficiary approach aims to design effective responses targeting the most vulnerable, aligned with the Commission staff working document on applying the 5 principles of the human rights-based approach. For this, efficient targeting is crucial, and also to include the beneficiaries in the process when possible, which is difficult, as Matilde just said. The poorest and the marginalized communities or individuals should be collectively identified, and an outreach should be organized so that they can be included throughout the programming and the project cycle in the ideal conditions. For targeting, we can use the equity tool, which is provided in the guide, and you can also Google it. It's just equitytool.org. And this is a survey which is quite simple and help us to identify through a quantitative assessment on which wealth quintile the beneficiary belongs. So we can place our people, our beneficiaries, in that distribution of income that we said at the beginning, and it does not require hard economic knowledge. So responding to the question raised earlier, this could be a very useful tool. There will be more about this tool and others on Friday when you look at the inequality marker. We can go to some actions to support the beneficiary approach. So as said, reaching out to the poorest and excluded is crucial for tackling inequalities, but this can be very difficult. First, because you need to know who these communities are and where they live, and precisely their condition for exclusion often makes them invisible. So again, this is already one area where we need an extra effort to identify where and who these people are. Some actions that can facilitate the awareness process and the discussion about inequalities include use participatory approaches to consult and involve the key national and local stakeholders in the design of effective responses towards the most vulnerable. When possible, you can use focus groups with the actual beneficiaries, so you get more direct information. You can also support the participation of women and marginalized groups to learn how to better address the structural causes behind the discrimination and how the different policies and cultural norms and attitudes affect them. Again, participatory approaches are very useful in this regard. Civil society organizations are often very valuable interlocutors also, so this would be your potential allies in the field. The participation of women's groups in the process, for example, doing gender-responsive budgeting, has been very important to the design of policies that addresses the needs and demands of women and girls. Also supporting women's organizations is a very effective way to achieve progress on equality and women's rights. So probably on the gender field is where we have more experiences on how to do this. But this will be more and beyond the gender inequalities. We can also support and promote the participation of diverse stakeholders, with a special emphasis on including the voice of people from marginalized and excluded communities during the context analysis, the definition, programming, formulation, identification, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, so throughout the project cycle. And the participation of the most vulnerable should be an integral part of the process. I will add also here that, as mentioned earlier, it's also important to include in the dialogue other stakeholders so that the realization of the existence of inequalities is shared by the different stakeholders and not only by those directly involved or directly affected in the marginalization. Also, I hear one, yeah, okay, thank you. Also support and facilitate the reinforcement and capacity building of existing social dialogue mechanisms, including different actors, as I was saying, from different constituencies and at different levels. This should be done during the analysis of the context regarding inequalities, but also throughout the formulation and all the phases of the project, to ensure that all the different views have the voice at the different stages. So efficient targeting through a lot of participation and dialogue. The second key principle is accountability and transparency, I would say. Accountability is fundamental to tackle inequalities because the lack of accountability and transparency is a breeding ground for corruption, which strongly impacts inequality. Also, improving transparency goes hand in hand with the need to create, facilitate, and protect space and spaces in general for civil society participation. We know how important is the whole issue of shrinking civic space and the need for enabling a space for the participation, so that the demands of the most marginalized are heard and taken into account. Both transparency and accountability are supported by improving access to information, hence enabling that civic space. Again, the lack of access to information, for example, on policy decision-making processes and agreements on budget allocations and expenditures, reduces the chances for citizens to influence and improve their lives. In the same way, the lack of disaggregated data required to measure and expose the inequalities, as said at the beginning, makes the situation invisible. And if the situation of inequalities and exclusion is invisible, it implies that governments take decisions in blindness regarding the impacts on inequalities. So again, the availability of data and the access to the data, that transparency and access to information is crucial. And again, transparency and accountability will help us to break the cycles of political capture that I referred to at the beginning this morning. The cycles of wealth and power accumulation, an aspect that is crucial to tackle poverty and inequality. It also contributes to better planning, monitoring, and evaluate the impact of policies on inequalities. So some actions regarding accountability will include, for example, orient cooperation towards strengthening democratic institutions, in particular in relation to legislation for freedom of information. We can also promote transparency in access to information, including information regarding decision-making, contracting processes, land reform, tax and budget initiatives. So all information that should be public because are related to public policies. We can also strengthen national statistical systems and capacities to generate disaggregated data related to inequalities between different groups of people. As said already several times, this data is key for analyzing inequalities and for measuring the impact of our interventions, and is in many cases, or in most of the cases, either absent or very difficult to get. So all the efforts on strengthening the national statistical systems and capacities are very much needed to tackle inequalities. Also, support anti-corruption laws and measures, as well as their implementation and institutions in charge. Support also the establishment and promotion of channels for public and private accountability of different actors. You can also support building civil society capacities, their access to information, their ability to conduct research and analysis in key areas, and in the implementation of social audit initiatives, such as, for example, the public hearings that we have seen in many of our areas of interventions. And last but not least, strong attention should be placed also on enhancing participation, as has been mentioned earlier. Okay, this will be developed also later in the module. Key principle number 3 is that redistribution from the top 10, the richest top 10 in the society towards the bottom 40%. This is called the redistribution target in the bottom 40, but we don't forget that redistribution effect, which implies the top 10%. So raising income for the bottom 40% while ensuring a fair contribution of the top 10 is crucial to reduce inequality. And this is illustrated in the indicator of the SDGs 10.1, that was referred to earlier. On this, fiscal policy is the crucial instrument, and fiscal regarding its full dimension. So on the one hand, the tax system to collect revenue, who pays, how much, and for which concept. This is key. And the budget expenditure, so the allocation of public funding to what policies and for whom. Some of the guidelines to reducing inequalities with this 40% approach would be the promotion of universal and free access to quality healthcare and education. And here, this is, already absorbed in our thinking and doing on poverty reduction. But here we want to put the emphasis all the time on the need to apply, as we will see in the next step, geographical and spatial targeting where services are inexistent. So an extra effort to reach those remote and marginalized communities. Similarly, the promotion of social protection policies, again, targeted towards the most remote areas and including those communities which are most vulnerable to food and climate risk and general discrimination. Sponsor the creation of quality jobs with high labor standards and prioritizing low-skilled labor and decent conditions. Promote access to services, infrastructures, and means of political participation for specific groups, specifically for the marginalized groups. And again, last but not least, support fair and progressive tax reforms for citizens and for firms, so the whole tax system. Support the tax authorities also to monitor and evaluate the results against improved conditions of the bottom 40%. So again, in principle, none of these lines are new to any of you, but we are always putting the emphasis on that extra effort to reach the poorest. And also, I would say, and you will see in the thematic discussions in the next few days, not only that effort to reach the marginalized, but also to look at these sectors, to which extent we are favoring the use of certain public services by people that have the means. So I always give the example, a teacher or a doctor that may decide to move to the private provision of health or education because the conditions there are better. So in a way, public services need to compete and gain the battle against private sector services. So you don't, you keep the private services, but you need to really put the public, which are going to provide that universal access with the proper quality. Finally, the key principle number 4 is the spatial geographical targeting. This is very important, that spatial inequality should be investigated for a better understanding of inequality in a country. And this geographical lens can help identify new issues and new policy gaps for which geographically targeted interventions are required. And again, here we need that's what we call granularity, and again, a more detailed data and knowledge of the context, whether it's you put the boundaries where you want, in a province, in a region, in your country, to know what is happening inside, so we don't generalize. There will be differences between regions in one country. There are differences between urban and rural areas. There are also intra-urban inequalities, depending on the area in a city where you live. And there are inequalities also in the rural areas between rural centers versus the most remote areas. So again, be very careful when you refer to a certain area in your country to also look into what is happening inside that area. So there are several dimensions to take into account when studying spatial disparities in wealth or another aspects. Okay, this is in terms of actions that could support this exercise. You can conduct national level budget analysis, looking at how budget benefits different locations, whether regions, rural, urban, differences within urban areas and differences within rural areas. And this can reveal how public spending skews resources towards the most advantaged parts of the country. Often because it's the most efficient way to do it, or is the only way to do it, is the easiest way to do it. So it can be intentionally or unintentionally, but that budget allocation give us a lot of information. You can also support district and local level budget analysis and monitoring of efficiency at that local level. So the whole process, I understand, of the localization of SDG agendas, which many of you are involved in the countries, is key for this. So work with your local authorities and with the local civil society to do, and with the communities to do this budget analysis and the monitoring. And also provide an assessment of the quality of the service provision and also potential situations of corruption. You can again support the national statistical capacities to include data disaggregated by spatial dimensions also. Very difficult. And again, as I said before, even if you get this, you will need specific skills and knowledge to analyze the data. You can always commission or support research, specifically looking at different spatial dimensions, okay? We did this recommendation, comes straight from one of the AFD, funded research pieces from the Inequality Research Facility of the European Commission. And it was very clear that, that you need to look at what is happening in these different dimensions. And also support and facilitate dialogue with actors that are aware of these spatial dimensions. Okay, I think this is over to you, Jerome.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Thanks for taking us through these principles. These principles, you'll find them back indeed in the reference document, as we've mentioned. They are with this level of detail and suggestions of possible actions. And I think they've already portray the intersectionality that we've discussed this morning through the different type of inequalities and how to understand them and how they can be addressed by different perspective. So what we suggest to you now, and that's following still this reference document, is to look at the possible entry points for you in working with the reduction of inequalities in the design of your interventions, in the management of your plans for the strategic plan at country level. And obviously here there are two main entry points which are suggested before we go to the details of them. The first one is policy dialogue, and this is obviously linked to a number of actions you can carry out at country level. The idea of policy dialogue, and we'll come back to that with Mathilde soon, is to use it as a tool to raise inequality into the agenda that you're having with the government, with the country as all of the stakeholders, and with the other partners of that countries. Obviously, policy dialogue will be different from context to context. You don't address the same inequality issues in the same way in different countries. It needs to be brought about in a manner that diffuse as much as you can the tensions and address the contentious issues in a way that is palatable. And that's obviously making that difficult, but that needs to be done because of the importance of inequalities that are hindering our capacity to reach the SDGs and to foster economic growth. So adapting the policy dialogue, we'll come back to that, to the political, cultural, social, policy context of the country. And then mainstreaming reduction of inequalities in current programming and in new programs and projects, and raising inequality as an issue in existing programs and projects. Obviously, here we have a feedback loop between the first point and the second point. You can use what you plan and design now. You can use what exists already to better understand the picture of inequalities. Use your monitoring, use the indicators that you can put into your evaluation matrix. Plan your interventions with the idea to understand, analyze, and address inequalities, and we'll come back to that on day 5 with the inequality marker, so that can also inform your agenda for dialogue. Obviously, there's no blanket approach. This is all context specific, and we'll look at the decision tree that has been designed for you just in a minute. But do see these two big areas as completely complementary and self-reinforcing or mutually reinforcing. And that's a decision tree that you will find in your reference document. Obviously, here you end up with most of what we usually do, design and implement through your work in delegations, political and policy dialogue, dialogue on projects and programs, formulate, design inequality projects and programs, or mainstream inequalities in projects and programs, mainstream inequality consideration in existing portfolio through what is already ongoing. But that depends on the initial part of the tree that is focused on the existence of quantitative and qualitative data on inequality and knowledge about inequality drivers, what we have seen this morning. And obviously, according what you know, what is available, you have different ways to address this initial situation. One of the key ways is to support National Statistical Office and to support research at country level. That can be done in partnership with other EU member states, with TEI, or with university support as well, or specific TA. But on the other side, you can also work on policy dialogue to address inequalities. And obviously, post-dialogue, because inequality is a contentious issue, we'll need to deal with how do I support approaches thanks to my dialogue? How do I create space for being able to address inequality drivers through my dialogue and therefore through the different interventions I may carry out? So that brings us to the third level of information. Do we keep on the post-dialogue on equalities alive, and how do we do that? Identifying and agreeing on new type of supports to reduce inequalities, specifically or through different sectors and thematics, or integrating that thinking through our current contributions. So that tree is a decision tree. It's nothing else. No, it's not the panacea, but it's a way to keep on thinking about it and addressing the issues of inequalities in what we do. Now, we don't want to keep you listening to us only and waiting. We would like you to be active with us. So we have planned, again, a little exercise where we would like you to feed us back on what you would do with this decision tree. So the point is to take 3 minutes, look at the decision tree again on your own, and see how it fits into your own country context. Could you pin 3 of the steps? And we'll look at which of the steps you think are critical ones for your country. And there, in the second question, please let us know which one you think it would be the most challenging in your country. It's all anonymous. I will remind you that. I will switch here to the link in our Space platform. You should be able to do the same. If we scroll down, it should be, no, that's not the wrong, that's the correct link, so sorry. If we scroll down, we should be able to see that, that decision tree, and you're able to click and choose which of the steps are the most important, and you already see the response coming up online. Beautiful camembert, colorful one as well. Thanks for that. I hope you're all able to connect and go to the right link. If not, we will repost the correct link on the chat to make sure that you're able to reach. We'll leave you to answer a little bit because there's only a few answers so far.
And again, as Jérôme said and Gabriela said too, this exercise is really important for us because we also need to learn from for your difficulties and challenges in order to be able to better support you. And also, we'll have this time on doing the Q&A question, and that could also be the opportunity for you to raise your needs also that we can support, that we can answer.
I hope you're able to come in. I think so.
Yeah, we have already 20 answers. 25.
Excellent. Okay, 1 or 2 more minutes to keep on answering, and then we'll look at your answers. If you have issues with connecting, please do let us know so we can troubleshoot. Okay, so maybe what we can look at, so obviously the biggest problem seems to be for you existence of quantitative and qualitative data on inequality and knowledge about inequality drivers. So that it's obviously coming as the biggest, one of the biggest challenge, if not the biggest. Support, well, policy dialogue on inequality is also seen as a critical element, especially with creating space for dialogue, keeping dialogue alive, having political post-dialogue on inequalities. That seems to be really challenging. And linked to the initial existence of quantitative or qualitative data, the support to National Statistical Office and research seem to be really critical for you. So there's other elements that where you would be working upon. Obviously, you're mentioning here mainstream inequality in current projects and programs. So that's great because that can both help you understand better and prepare the ground through dialogue and through that better understanding. You're mentioning assess approach for support, the type of interventions that can be carried out, create space for dialogue on inequality drivers, keep policy dialogue on inequality alive, okay. And then the others with a bit less focus, but on how to formulate and design inequality in project programs. So we'll have to take a look at that carefully in day 5, because this is very important for us. Through the inequality marker, we can formulate and design inequality projects and programs, or integrate them with addressing specific drivers into our sector and policy support. Okay, perhaps we can look at your second answer, which step may be the most challenging for you?
And maybe we can give you 1 minute to answer this question, 1 or 2 minutes.
So you have to pin the icon. So you have to take the pin here that you can see and pin it somewhere. So you see the pin here I'm playing with that becomes green. You can place it somewhere. So keep on placing your pins. Only a few answers.
So to summarize, maybe just the first question. The first question was really about to understand which step you are currently using in your country. And now the objective is really to know which of the steps are the most challenging.
So just to be clear, at the bottom of that picture, you have a pin here. If you click on it, you can place it on any of the steps that you see on that chart, on that decision tree. So you can tell us which of these steps would be the most challenging for you. I hope it works for everyone.
And for that, the answers sound very interesting, because we saw at in the first question that the steps that you use the most in your country are related to data and to support National Statistical Office also. And we also now notice that the more challenging one should sound, but we will let you 1 or 2 more minutes to answer, but related to the project cycle and to the design of the action.
Okay, just asking a question to our support platform, Andrew and Luciana, do you think there's a problem with the system? Because I see just a very few answers.
Not that I can identify any struggle, but if someone maybe has a struggle with finding the pin, they can also maybe quickly unmute themselves and let us know, or write it on the chat.
We have more or less 25 answers, maybe 1 minute more.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see new pins coming up, so I guess those of you who could answer have answered. So what do we find here? A bit difficult. We don't have a huge sample, but I think what comes about is quite similar to what we've seen in the first question. We find that creating space for dialogue on inequality drivers, keeping policy dialogue on inequalities alive, are problematic on these two steps for you. So the dialogue issue there is difficult for you to envisage, and that resonates strongly with what Teresa was advocating to us earlier on today, that dealing with the reduction of inequalities is contentious. We're dealing with top 10 and bottom 40 or bottom 10, but usually bottom 40%, that's our target, and the top 10 earners or in terms of wealth. So this is indeed creating a huge tension, and we usually talk and address those of the top 10 as part of our work, because these are usually the people we work with, unless we work directly with the final beneficiaries. And then the other part you're mentioning here, I see, again, resonating with what was above, the focus on data and access to data and supporting systems at national level and research that give us data. And another packet here on identifying and agreeing the type of support that would bring in inequalities to drive sector and policy response and formulate our support to that. And that will address definitely on day 5 with the inequality marker and how to do so. So thank you very much for attempting to answer all of these two questions and go through the maze of this decision tree. This is quite interesting, and we hope that you keep on answering as we talk. This would be useful to us. So moving on, we're coming back to where we were. And basically what we're going to be doing now is taking you through a number of entry points in terms of process, practicalities, challenges that we can deal with. But that these are the entry points that can, at any time in the programming cycle, enable us to focus on inequalities and can also help us focus the midterm review upcoming for the MIP. So 4 entry points that we can work with. Conducing context analysis in relation to inequalities. We'll keep on coming back to that. This is about measurement. This is also about the inequality marker. We'll look at that again on day 5, but today as well. Raising inequality awareness in policy dialogue and keeping dialogue alive. Obviously, this needs to be addressed carefully and as the EU. So we have our values there to do so. Mainstreaming the reduction of inequalities at different stages of the project cycle, and how to do so, how to use our tools to bring in indicators to have this focus, and addressing inequalities through budget support. That is indeed an instrument that offers us a very strong dialogue, technical, and budgetary platform, obviously, policy platform, to integrate the reduction of inequalities, either through taxation, either through the dealing with tax expenditures, either through public spending. We'll come back to that as well. So now on each of these entry points. Context analysis. I think this is me. I forgot. Yes. Yes, sorry. My bad. Entry point 1, context analysis. What is known about inequality? This is what we want to address here. And obviously, what's important here is to focus on understanding what is existing to openly talk about inequalities. So both understanding the sensibilities about inequalities, and we'll come back to that with the impact it has on post-dialogue, which potential sectors are best to address inequalities in the country where we work. And then from there on, from this analysis, start to define what is needed, what is desirable, what is realistic. Those obviously quite different whether you're in, as we saw, Senegal or Tunisia. Having a continuous update, so keep on working with data, keep on working with qualitative data, quantitative data, obtaining information from what we do, obtaining information from research on the National Statistical Office, working with the other partners, often obviously in countries working with ILO, the World Bank will provide us a wealth of information to understand inequalities, and use this to exercise caution in how we address them, not to take action that is not fully informed and verified before we do so. The key with context analysis, as always, is about getting access to data, and data we can trust and make sense of. There, obviously, a collaborative approach to this context analysis is critical, collaborative within your delegations, and collaborative with the other partners and as many stakeholders as we can work with in the country. There are tools to carry out this context analysis. A number of these tools will be brought back to you on day 5 when we go through the inequality marker. Obviously, these tools are also listed into your reference document you can access to. They are with the links, there are details. We list the inequality diagnostic that's been developed by the French Development Bank, AFD, as part of the Inequality Research Facility. World Bank, as we mentioned, provide the systemic country diagnostics, can be very useful. We'll come back to the commitment to equity assessment on day 5. You can go to the commitment to reducing inequality index from Oxfam that you can also find online. The multidimensional inequality framework also by Oxfam, but you can also use public expenditure reviews to carry out geographic allocation of budgets, integrate that into your analysis so that you can better deal with this. Teresa, you raise your hand.
Yes, thanks. If I may just to add one thing on the context analysis and the beginning of this entry point, because bearing in mind these 2 challenges of the sensitivity and the availability of data or not, often the use of research is a very good tool to initiate dialogue. Because you can be in a more objective position using the research. So either existing research, as Jerome was saying, done by others, presenting that research to an audience that you invite, and you start to bring the people that you want to get involved together. It's a very neutral way to start this dialogue on inequalities. And then sometimes the decision will be to conduct more research or to go into already policy design or intervention design. But just bear in mind that link between the research and the possibility to use the existing research for dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you, Teresa.
Indeed, and to complete also what Teresa just said, it was exactly the objective of the research facility. So the research facility, so implementing by IFD and funding by the EU, and which is coordinated so from the headquarters, so by unit G4, has really the objective to develop the research in order to launch policy dialogue through a neutral door. So the research facility has developed a lot of inequality diagnostics and also fiscal incidents in several countries. And now with the extension of the facility that will go until 2025, the objective is not to use these switches and to begin this sensitive dialogue. And for example, we can see that we have very good result in the South Africa, good result that we can see because the main stakeholders are now involved in the process, and even the cabinet of the president is involved, which could be seen through its future participation of the annual conference that we will organize in South Africa in order to present the research results of the facility. So what is even more surprising sometimes, because in South Africa, as we all know, is one of the most unequal countries. So the dialogue was even more difficult, and going through the research sometimes could be a way to go without the political background that we can have.
Yeah, exactly. That was the point. Thanks, Matilde. Yeah.
So it puts the onus on the research to be a research that is accepted by all stakeholders and shows that the research questions and how they were addressed were actually driven with the country context. Next, policy dialogue as an entry point. I think this is now your presentation.
Yes, it is. So maybe just to recap very, very briefly, so that we are all on the same page. So really this session is dedicated to tools and guidance that could help you mainstream inequality through the project cycle. We have briefly reviewed 4 guiding principles, and thanks to Teresa. And now the objective is really to understand which are the entry points you can use in order to mainstream inequalities. So we have seen from the country analysis and the importance also of the research in this country analysis. And now the objective is to talk about the policy dialogue. And it was one of the points that you mentioned as important in the first session. So policy dialogue is necessary for integrating inequality, but is also, in my opinion, one of the most difficult. And I think it's also one thing that you have raised in the decision tree. So policy dialogue is often referred to as the software of cooperation. It's not necessarily related to ongoing project and budget support, whether it usually supports them. And to mainstream the reduction of inequality, it is essential and necessary to undertake dialogue at multiple levels and with multiple stakeholders. But as we have said in the first session, inequality is inherently political, is a sensitive subject, and its drivers change only when the distribution of wealth and of power does. So one of the objectives of the policy dialogue that need to be done in order to mainstream inequality is really to seek to lower barriers to change. So encouraging domestic and social dialogue and set of governments to acknowledge the challenge of inequality. And so the policy dialogue that should be conducted during a project about the EU should promote the voices of all stakeholders from first different levels, so at the country, local, provincial, national level, and also included all constituencies, so government, donors, private sector, civil societies, and also some representation of direct beneficiaries, which could be difficult to reach. So the objective of this policy dialogue that will happen at multiple levels with multiple actors that will help to lower barriers to change and promote the voices of all stakeholders will have the objective to build trust, but not only with its partners, but also between the different stakeholders. If possible, this dialogue should include the media, but we all know that depending on the country specificities, it could be very difficult to make the inequality narrative known and acceptable. So what should be the overall EU message? So what should you exactly, when you arrive in front of stakeholders, say? And I hope we will be able to give you some of some entry points. So I think the first mention that should be conveyed is that the EU that it should be said that the EU has developed effort in international countries to contribute to the fight to inequality. So inequality is one of the priorities of the EU in order to build this inclusive and sustainable society that was mentioned both by the Commissioner and by Erika at the opening of the first session. Second, I think it's very important in the narrative, in addition to say that inequality is a main priority, is a main objective of the EU, to say that the EU has firmly embodied the fight against inequality as a cross-cutting objective of its geographical priorities. So that inequality is in all the sectors that we are planning to address, and also in the global gateway. One of the main challenges that we will have today is we need to make this this narrative of linking the global gateway to inequality, but as the global gateway will contribute to be a catalyst also to some SDG 10 being part of it, so the SDG dedicated to inequality, here there is a link. to be made. But again, it's something that we can come back to, and the G4 unit is very happy to support you in order to continue building this narrative and also taking into account your country specificities. Something that should also be done, in addition also to say that inequality is a priority, to say that it is a cross-cutting priority, it's also to explain why inequality is important. And we have seen that in the first session, why inequality matters, but it's important to say that inequality hides socioeconomic development and that it will reduce to achieve a better development outcomes. And in order to do that, in order to answer to the challenge, it is important to lift up the bottom 40% while ensuring the fair contribution of the top 10% and 1%. In the concept of the bottom 40%, the 10% and 1% is not explicitly mentioned. It was a question that was raised during the first session. And why? Because we know that it is a sensitive subject. And the people to which you will talk are often part of the 10% and the 1%. So indeed, it's easier to begin with this bottom 40% approach, so very related to the poverty eradication that could be easier to convey. But after that, to really make the point that inequality is not only about that, it's also multidimensional, so and intersectional, and also it's a relative concept, taking into account the differences between the bottom 40% and the 10%. So policy should benefit more the worst of groups and less so the better off groups. Another thing on which you should insist in the EU message, so we see that it should be a priority, a cross-cutting issue that should target the bottom 40%. But another point that you can also use is that depending on the level of inequality in your country, you could emphasize the need to increase the mobilization of domestic resources in a progressive way. And the Unit E1 will organize tomorrow morning a session that will be dedicated to that. So it will be a great opportunity for you to go and to have more keys in order to build this policy dialogue. So, as I said also at the beginning, so inequality is a sensitive issue, and indeed the EU should stand strong. And it was the message that was conveyed by our Commissioner during the Cooperation Day, that inequality is a day-to-day work. It demands courage. And what is very difficult with this point is that we also like some tools and some indicators, because it's an evolving subject. And indeed, you can have this impression that the guidance that you have are not enough, but there are some tools that exist in terms of country analysis, in terms of indicators, in terms of markers also. And you can already use this tool in order to continue putting inequality at the table of the negotiation. And in the countries where there is this policy dialogue space, which is not the case for every country, there is also this possibility we need to create conditionalities linked to governments, both in budget support operation as well as in projects. And maybe I can give you an example of what has been done. I think it's always useful to know exactly what has been done in other countries, but maybe to give you the example of Morocco, it was an example of a difficult but ultimately successful policy dialogue on inequality. So Morocco received large amounts of policy of budget support from the EU and other donors. And with the support of the EU, of the World Bank, of the IMF, and other donors, so Morocco started in-depth reforms of its public administration and fiscal systems at the end of the 1990s. And thanks to the research facility, with the help of the research facility, so implementing by IFD, the Moroccan government conducted a fiscal incidence assessment that is always as it is used today. And one of the major advances in terms of inequality, so was maintained 15 years later. So with the EU budget support condition on the evaluation of fiscal expenditures and its publication with the annual budget law. So beside this major step, forward on transparency. Other areas of focus then included inter alia, the reduction of tax exemptions, the simplification of tax brackets, the transparency of the tax system, and the revision of VTA. So what is very interesting here is that, as Teresa said, thanks to the research, and the research help then to gather all the stakeholders at the table, then to begin talking about inequality, why is important to understand the concept that is also where, depending on the country, one sector could be emphasized than another. You can, after that, create conditionalities in budget support, which be discussed after that, and then have concrete and direct impact on the reduction of inequalities. Last slides, but it's what more or less what I have. It's to summarize, so more or less all the points. So policy dialogue, a difficult one, because depending of the sensibility of a country, politics, tension, culture, norms. But could be done through research, implying all stakeholders, by understanding what is acceptable and not depending on the country, by maybe focusing first on the sector that is less contentious, because the government has already an interesting in, and then you can bring the subject of inequality. Ideally, the inequality should be mainstream in all sectors, but depending again on the sensibility of the country and on the EU priorities. One sector could be favor other than another at the beginning in order to put inequality at the table of the policy dialogue.
Thank you so much. So we'll push on with the next two entry points. So the first one, or the third one, sorry, is a project cycle. So again, perhaps hammering the point a bit further, to ensure inequality or the reduction of inequalities is fully taken on board through different steps in that cycle. And we're repeating, but there's now an inequality marker that's been developed and that will help you do so from the moment you start your context analysis to the moment you define your intervention logic and establish your monitoring framework and evaluation framework. What this does is, according to the sector that is most, perhaps can benefit most from this approach, or is most ripe for such an approach to deal with the reduction of inequalities, use your design phase of your new support so that you can bring a new narrative in your intervention logic. And that's very much what is at stake here with the entry point on project cycle. This is something that we are suggesting you can do. This is something that already, with the support of unit G4 and some units, is being done on specific sectors and intervention logic at sector level. And you will see the results in terms of intervention logic for education over sectors and their indicators. So you'll have even more support to bring this perspective into your work of identification and formulation, so that the narrative can change. And if you change narrative in your intervention, that means you change the narrative in how you monitor, in how you evaluate, and obviously in how you dialogue. So that's very fundamental. And that's this idea of implementing this inequality sensitive, or using this inequality lens in monitoring and evaluating, not just forgetting about those, so that when you're using those monitoring or evaluation matrices, you've got those aspects well taken on board, and see how we can deal with the relevance of interventions, with the value added, and with the risk and opportunities to do better or to avoid some risks. That brings us to the last entry point, which is budget support. Now, entry point 4, obviously budget support is often portrayed as a critical instrument that can enable a stronger dialogue and a stronger policy focus. This is true, but it can be true of any instrument. What is specific about budget support is that it goes to the core of the budget, obviously, and the core of the financing of the policies and the implementation of the policies. And doing so means you're bringing to bear the inequalities and their reduction through the focus of the country to achieve the SDGs, the focus of the country to bring this SDGs view into their sector planned outcomes, and bringing these outcomes to be supported by, or to be backed up with your budget support through dialogue, through financing, and the creation of incentives, and through the possible technical cooperation. Obviously, there again, the choice of sectors is critical to see what is ripe, what might not be ripe. With budget support, there are critical elements, change in institutions, obviously all of what has been called these induced outputs, the change in governance at sector level, the betterment of the quality of budgeting work, the service delivery attitudes, and bringing the service delivery to the groups, to the geographies that are usually perhaps excluded or less benefiting from public spending, should help bring on board an equality lens for your budget support. And other aspects with budget support, well, you're talking to the Ministry of Finance, you're looking at the budget as an instrument, as a political decision, as a policy decision, but you're also looking at the budget in terms of fiscal policies and domestic resources mobilization. So that's also a call for the mobilizing the top 10 capacity to finance the state through taxation, and to use that for domestic resource mobilization, also financing for development, and having that lens on redistribution through your fiscal policies, both taxation and spending policies. With budget support, you have a strong entry point for your policy dialogue at the macro level, discussing the space for creating the space for new discretionary expenditures that can be better directed towards the most disadvantaged groups of people, supporting change, and offer a legitimate opportunity for the EU to discuss policies, their financing, their objectives, and their results. This is done in most countries where budget support is being used, but obviously it offers this strong platform, and bringing that inequality focus is made perhaps easier when you have this ongoing type of operations. You can use your eligibility criteria, macro analysis, the public finance systems, the policy analysis, or the transparency of the budget system to mainstream the inequality lens. And all of those perspectives, these 4 eligibility criteria, have been mentioned in one way or the other this morning and early on today as entry points or as principles to be dealt with. And as mentioned earlier, you're directly speaking with the Ministry of Finance, so you can talk about domestic revenue mobilization. This is critical for the state's resilience, for the state's financing, for its development. And that also speaks to other partners that have got the same attitude or the same focus with the IMF, obviously stability in financing the budget, with the World Bank financing the development of the country. Last, on entry point for enhanced policy dialogue at macro level, take advantage of monitoring of budget support, and this is done through the annual disbursements requests and reviews by your EU delegations. Take advantage of the midterm reviews to assess to which extent ongoing programs and policies have had an impact on inequalities. Create ad hoc spaces to do so and discuss on inequalities and draw lessons together with your partners. That means government and other stakeholders at sector level.
And to complete maybe, but just to, as Jérôme mentioned, the importance of the midterm review. And as you may know, so the midterm review will begin next year. And inequalities is one of the main important criteria with migration and multilateralism. So it will be a great opportunity for us to have a better vision of the place of inequality in our project and interventions, and also in the effort of the countries towards inequality. So it could also give you a better sense on how the inequality is really embedded in your country. So definitely it will be a great exercise, and we will be all in contact for completing it.
Thanks for that. So we are moving to the end of this second session as well. Again, we want to ask you questions. What was clear, what remains unclear, and questions you want to raise. You're welcome to do so on the platform just now. I see there may be other questions that we have to address already. In the meantime.
And indeed, we have decided to make this session, the presentation, a little bit less longer than the first one, in order also to give you the opportunity maybe to take the floor also. If you have any question, or also if you want to share any challenges that you are confronting in your delegation, because sometimes also what is the most interesting is that this training is also a space of dialogue and an opportunity also to exchange any experience that you may have and you would like to share. So please, in addition to the platform, if you want to take the floor, do not hesitate to raise your hand, and happy to give you the floor so that you can share your experience.
Hélène Confrey, please. You raised your hand, so go ahead. We saw that you posted the chat, so maybe you can.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Apologies, I was unable to follow the first session due to conflicting agendas and time zones, but I followed very closely the second one. I think, it'd be hard to question or doubt any of the theories that you're putting on the table and presenting to us, but often the reality of the context where we work is very, very different. Just to give you a clear example, I'm based here in Paraguay, and I think one of my colleagues, Vera, is also in the forum. Now, there is a certain amount of cynicism and skepticism towards the international agenda. The Global South does not necessarily agree with what the Global North proposes. In particularly when we look at the Bretton Woods institutions, so the impact of whether it's the World Bank or the IMF, we know of the austerity programs, we know of structural adjustment programs in the past, and many of these have really left a legacy of inequalities as well. And I think what you mentioned at the beginning, inequalities are multidimensional, multi-sectoral. We tend from the global north to look at them through the lens, to be honest, of neoliberalism. So we're always sort of trying to convince the global south countries that it's better to reduce inequalities because there are returns on investment to health, or returns on investment to education, or returns on investment to improved infrastructure. I think what we need to focus more and better on in the future is this alternative or complementary approach to inequalities. And that's looking much more about issues of power structure and empowerment. And then, of course, there is this big issue of gender, which is incredibly sensitive in many countries, and Paraguay isn't immune to that either. So I would say context, it really, really matters. And in terms of policy dialogue, well, of course, there are all different levels of policy dialogue, whether it's at a more technical level, a more ground roots level, or a more strategic level. But again, you're often talking to interlocutors who recognize that inequalities exist, but they're not necessarily going to be in favor of reducing gaps for a number of issues, which could be cultural, could be religious, or simply economic, if you like. There's only so much in a pie, so if I give more away, there's less for me. So what I would say is that what I've seen so far is quite idealistic in a way. So one of the big challenges that we have on the ground, whether it's Latin America, Asia, or Africa, is how to translate and adapt this, I would say, to local context, and to really, really understand your local political economy, I would say even the sociology of the country that you're in. So it's a very, very complex process if we really aim to reduce inequalities. Thank you. So it's more a comment than a question, to be honest.
And thank you so much. It was really interesting. But I think you didn't introduce yourself at the beginning. I think it could also be useful for colleagues. So you are working on the Paraguay delegation, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, apologies for that. My name is Helen Conifrey. I'm a project coordinator in the education field. We've actually primarily had budget support programs, so we really have had a foot in the door in terms of policy dialogue. And why I mentioned in the chat box this idea that international cooperation can be ideologized is that we're currently in quite a conflictual situation with the local government and civil society, where they're attacking very strongly the European Union and other international cooperation organizers, indicating basically that we're trying to impose conditionalities and impose certain ideologies under the guise of reducing inequalities. I mean, this is really how we are being attacked. So I think we need to be aware of that as well. Thank you.
Definitely, and even more, if I'm not mistaken, that inequality is a main priority of your programming. You have been identified as an equality flagship also. So I know that it's even more important to have your point of view that inequality is one of your main objectives.
If I may come in, but also I think Teresa may want to come in on this comment that you raised, Helen. Indeed, your comment is very important. For those of you who were here this morning, you would recognize in the comment of Helen the 5 perspectives that was presented, and the moral perspective, the Kuznets perspective, and the political economy perspective, just to cite those 3, also the efficient economy perspective. So indeed, it could be seen as cynicism, that on the guise of economic efficiency, on the guise of economic growth, we're trying to address inequalities with some interest hidden agenda. There's a moral perspective that is clear. This is well reflected into the EU fundamental values, and that's what we are also pushing through here. So obviously, the reference document may look idealistic. It's just offering a way to implement the development agenda as written, using the instruments at hand and reflecting the EU fundamental values. That said, and I will then leave the floor to Teresa, no one say it's not contentious. Actually, it's extremely contentious. The bottom 40, top 10 is very, very complex to deal with. And obviously, there are over interest and over layers of complexity that comes according to different countries because of the country context, but also the international context that plays sometimes against us. So perhaps, Teresa, you want to have a word on that, because I think that's a very important element for many of the colleagues in delegations.
Yeah, thanks a lot, and thanks, Helen, for the comment. I fully agree. I mean, on the one hand, that is very context specific, and also on the fact that it's very contentious, and that was my intention in the session this morning, was precisely to convey that. That if we say that we are going to tackle inequalities, we need to do something different from when we are only, and I put only into quotes because it's a huge endeavor, fighting poverty, sorry. So if we decide and we express that we want to not only work towards poverty reduction, but addressing inequalities, then we know, for all the reasons that we explained earlier, that we are going to have to touch, as you very well said, Helen, at the heart of the political structures. And that is very sensitive. Now, what we are trying, so bearing in mind that, and bearing in mind the difficulties or the availability of data, what we did with the reference document is to try to provide an orientation, a sort of some guidance, indeed, on how to do the work, which are the existing tools and methodologies, and where do you find yourself in your project cycle, and what can you do in practice to take on board the challenge. But starting from the point that, yes, it is context specific, it is very contentious and very sensitive, and it is very difficult and more costly also in terms of budget and effort.
And it's not fast.
No.
So indeed, there, I think, in the work you've done also with G4 unit shows that the focus on how we do it and the focus on the process and the progress in changes in institutions, in how they work, will be critical to see whether we're going the right way.
But definitely, again, Hélène, thank you so much for your comment, and I pray also to have a bilateral call with you in order to maybe to edge a little bit on the narrative and how we can together maybe how I can to support you in maybe adapted it to your country specificities. Always happy to help and to support.
Thank you, Eloisa. We see that you have your hand raised, so please go ahead.
Hello, I hope it works okay with the mic.
It works.
I'm in Nepal.
You're clear now. Thank you.
It's 7:45 p.m. here, so I guess you have a wide range of time zones right now.
Right.
So I would like to raise 2 points. One is not too far from what Helen said, but so the first is on policy dialogue. I think the difficult, maybe the complexity that is not conveyed in your slides is that you are always wanting to influence the policy dialogue, but while always giving a lot of ownership to the government, right? So when you are if it's in your hand to decide who is participating and not in the hand of the government, then the ownership is going to be reduced. So you have to really work together with them to make sure that it's as inclusive as can be, or that the certain messages that you want certain people to pass are there. But it's not as simple. I mean, we cannot just go to the government and say, we want this policy dialogue with these actors discussing these themes, because this is not policy dialogue, you know, and especially you have to let them lead the way in a way. You can influence it, and you have to really generate a lot of trust, which is a little bit in line with what Helen was saying, when trust is not there and there is other issues. So this is on the one hand. On the second part, in Nepal, we have a lot of geographic inequalities, and especially with the very remote areas where access to services is very, very low. However, providing services in these very remote areas, and by very remote, I'm talking walking 3 days in order to arrive to the road, that will then take you 2 days to arrive to the provincial capital. And we are talking about a country that is 127,000 kilometers, so a fourth of France or a fourth of Spain. So obviously providing services and addressing these inequalities is much more expensive. I mean, this last mile delivery is extremely expensive. So I think that this is also something that we have to think and balance, because we have, on the one hand, leave no one behind, and on the other hand, we have to be efficient, and we have to make sure that the money that we spend is really benefiting the most people possible. So that's another complicated issue that I would like to also hear your thoughts on. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Eloise. And just a quick question before answering your comments. In which delegation are you working on? Nepal.
Nepal, I think.
Yes. So again, thank you so much, and definitely agree with you on the difficulty of policy dialogue and the difficulty to create trust between the different stakeholders, and even to bring them at the table. And maybe I would like to raise another difficulty that I was able to observe in Sudan and in Somalia when I was working there, is also the difficulty of mapping the different stakeholders, and of them also to have the knowledge of that another one exists, because before bringing them to the table, you should first, as a donor, to be able to map and to better understand the ecosystem in the country, which could be very different from even between the Somalia and Sudan. And in addition of that, to them to know also each other, and after that you can bring them to the table. So completely agree with you. Main challenge, and happy also to discuss it with you bilaterally in order to know which tools we can maybe design or think about in order to make this process easier. And maybe I will let also Teresa answer on how expensive it is to reach services, as it was something she already mentioned.
Yes, exactly. So on the, I mean, in fact, it is somehow reassuring to hear that we had a correct diagnostic of the difficulties of addressing inequalities from listening to you, because that's precisely the other point that we put the emphasis this morning is, on the one hand, how contentious is it in terms of political and social sensitivity, and the other point is how expensive it is to do it. For me, I have a background on policy research, so I'm a researcher. So I'm biased towards objectivity of the assessment of situations, but I also know how difficult the reality is. So that's why I'm saying, if we say, and if we want to say that we are addressing inequalities, the reduction of inequalities through a project intervention, we need to know how difficult it is in all these terms: sensitivity, data dependency, and lack of data in most of the cases, and the extra effort and the extra cost. In some cases, you can hear, well, you can shape your project and define the area of intervention so that you exclude those areas because because of geographical reasons or because of conflict, for example, you cannot physically go to these areas. Fine, you can redesign the area covered by the intervention, but then again, be very clear about how you want to measure your impact on inequalities. Because when you look at, let's say, the aggregate of a country, excluding the most remote areas or the most difficult accessible areas is going to bias your results. So it may turn out that when we come and do the research on what happened with inequalities in Nepal, if that was the case, that you don't make that extra effort of reaching those people because it's cheaper to reach more people closer to your urban areas. At the country level, in the aggregate, you may be reducing poverty in absolute numbers, but increasing inequalities, because the gap between those that are positively affected by the poverty reduction through your intervention will be far away, even more far away from those that are still in those remote areas and have not received the services. So that is what we need to be aware. So again, I said from the beginning, doing poverty reduction is good enough and it's a huge task. So be very careful when we say that we are also tackling inequalities, because unless we really tackle inequalities, we may have, in fact, a negative effect on inequalities, and we will be fooling ourselves at the end of the day. So it's very, very difficult. That's to completely agree with your comment.
Thank you for that, Teresa. Maybe also to add another example, I mean, the case of Nepal was brought to us by Eloisa with the difficulty in accessing specific areas because of the time it takes and the dangers associated to that. You can imagine the situations in countries where we have high insecurity in certain areas. Think of the Sahel at the moment, where traveling around is extremely difficult for anybody. And that also may exclude all areas from interventions. And that's a major issue with dealing with inequalities, obviously, that needs to be addressed. Perhaps we can also look at the question. You wanted to comment? No?
Yeah, no, just maybe just before that, and just to complete what Teresa and Jérôme said, we will present you on Friday a concrete tool, so the distributional impact assessment. You may already have heard about it because it's part of the criteria of the inequality marker. And this tool, based on the equity tool, so you will see it's a base of questionnaire that we have been drafting and on which we are continue working. So it's a tool and not a costly tool. And I think that is also important because, as you said, fighting against inequality is already expensive. So the tool that we are suggesting are not so expensive to be implementing. And this tool will help you to better target the beneficiary, at least to know where they are and who they are. And that also could maybe help you and should normally also help you to design policies, less costly policies that will be able to reach the most vulnerable, taking account their specificities.
Thank you. So there's a question here that reads, can we have any long-term impact without changing fiscal policies? If we think of it with what we need to do to address inequalities, what we've heard this morning and this afternoon, it seems that if you don't change your tax policies and your spending policies, so the overall fiscal approach of a government, you're not going to make a dent to inequalities in the long run. You cannot just have specific interventions. That's a whole policy approach. Obviously, we can sustain, we can support that, we can initiate that, we can use dialogue, we can use research, we can use interventions and budget support for doing so. But it was mentioned this morning, both by actually our director, Erika Gerritsen, and the commissioner, that on the one hand, we need to identify and understand where is the bottom 40, where is the top 10, so there is a need for that. But thereafter, we need to change the way we tax and the way we spend. So we have a fairer economy, better fiscal policies, better targeted spending, so that we are already investing in the right areas and investing in people, bringing those who don't have, or at the bottom 40, into the net for accessing quality education, health services, mobility, digitalization, and other aspects that needs to be addressed to reduce inequalities and provide everyone with the right opportunities to use their capabilities in their societies. So obviously, it's a long-term endeavor that needs to have an impact on that. And that is important because without those changes, you don't have the right financing for your own development policies overall. So that needs to happen in parallel to your domestic revenue mobilization. This morning, the Addis Ababa agenda was mentioned. That's a nice way to recall it here. Thank you. There may be questions in the Zoom chat, so let me check. Okay, we are back to Nepal. Okay. Most citizens are allergic to tax reform. This is an incremental process that can take decades. From Helen, thank you. Maybe if we can look at other questions, if we have a few here, you want to? Okay.
No. To answer a question that was in the platform, and I will maybe read it. Will you perform the midterm review relating assessment on tackling inequality in EU INPA action based on the I marker only, knowing the span of its use will be very short? Indeed, it is not the objective of that to use only the I marker, because as you said, it has just recently endorsed the term that you are implementing it in addition to the marker on which you are working. It's not possible only to base the midterm review on the I marker. It will not be the objective. The questionnaire and how inequality will be mainstream in the midterm review, it's an ongoing process, but the I marker is only a part of it.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've addressed most of the questions or what was remaining unclear, except perhaps the decision tree that is written here. I'm not too sure what was unclear about it. So if someone wants to share directly a question online with all of us, but the decision tree is a tool that was put into the reference document volume 3 to help you see where may you bring the issue of inequalities reduction in your agenda, in your work, whether for dialogue, whether for data, whether for ongoing interventions or new design. So let us know more if that was not well addressed. And I think we'll see different examples also throughout the week, with the different units, with different facilitators and guest speakers. And on day 5, with examples of the application of the I marker So there'll be more country examples coming up throughout the week.
Yes, indeed. We have in mind that what also could be very interesting for you is to know more from colleagues. Indeed, theory is useful, but it has also its limits. I think it was definitely raised, and there is, especially regarding inequality, a gap between theory and practice. And so the thematic situation, one of the objectives of that is really to bring guest speakers from different organizations, but also from delegation, in order for them to bring more of country examples. If there are no more questions, I think we can close this session, but wanted to personally say thank you to all of you for attending the first day.